Enda Kenny TD and Michael Jackson, Managing Partner at Matheson, thank you for joining us for our Brexit interview today, coming from the Four Seasons Hotel here in New York. Enda Kenny, you have served as Ireland's Prime Minister from 2011 to earlier this year in 2017. Given that you have had such strong working relationships with all of the key players in the EU and the UK, what would you say is the likelihood of moving from divorce to trade talks within the next few months? Or is the real question, can we avoid a breakdown of the talks within the next few months?
Well, it's unprecedented. It's going to be very difficult and very complex. Nobody ever left the European Union before. So I don't see these discussions being finalised at an early date. I do hope that the political leaders will focus between here and the end of the year on getting sufficient progress so that in the springtime they can start a new round of discussions focused on the future relationship between Europe and the United Kingdom. And I say that that's very important because companies will start to make decisions in the spring about where they're going to be in the next 3 to 5 years. And they need that clarity, they need that certainty, and that only comes from decisiveness and action taken by political leaders.
So where we are going to be in around March of 2018 is going to be very important in terms of businesses making those decisions that they need to make.
Britain is expected to leave 2 years after it triggered its letter of intent to leave, and that's by March of 2019. These discussions will not be concluded by 2019. Therefore, you need a transition period, and in my view, that transition period should be as long as is necessary to conclude an effective working agreement in the interests of everybody. It's not sufficient that Britain can say, we look for the best deal for Britain. There are 27 other countries on the other side of the table who have worked with Britain for many years, who also want an effective working outcome to this. So clarity, confidence, stability and decisiveness are issues that politicians must face over the next period.
And Michael, in terms of your experience with EU law and length of implementation periods, what are your views on how long a transition period, if the UK gets a transition deal, how long that period might realistically be for, or should it be for?
Well, Liz, it very much depends on what we're transitioning to. I do believe that regardless of what agreement is reached, a 2-year transition period will be too short to enable people to transition properly and smoothly to the new arrangements. 2 years is the average transition time for a single EU directive that has to be implemented by companies. We're talking about something much bigger and much more unprecedented here. I personally believe it's going to take anything up to 5 years to properly transition, but clearly the length of time will depend on whether we're transitioning to a soft Brexit position, which is closer to what we currently have at the moment, or whether we're transitioning to something completely different and a hard Brexit, in which case it's difficult to anticipate how long will be necessary to put the arrangements in place that will be required to govern that type of arrangement.
Enda, how would you describe the consequences of a hard Brexit, if there is one?
Potentially catastrophic. A hard Brexit means that there's no deal, no agreement, and that Britain decides to walk away. What we have at the moment is a single market of 500 million people. We have a customs union. We have potentially the opportunity for countries to continue to grow and prosper and provide employment. With Britain leaving and their intent to leave the single market and the customs union, it is impossible to have the same relationship in the future. And it's important to recognise that trade deals are different than a customs union or a single market. So I hope that realism dawns on people here now, and that we recognise that this is potentially one of the major shifts of the last 50 years. Nobody can answer your question truthfully and fully, but it has potentially a catastrophic result if it's a hard Brexit.
And Michael, what would you say are the main legal consequences for businesses operating in the UK of a hard Brexit?
For business, I personally think that a hard Brexit is the worst possible outcome. Businesses are looking for certainty, and a hard Brexit takes us into a position we've never been in before. It takes us into really uncharted waters. It's very difficult to see how businesses can plan in those scenarios. A hard Brexit assumes that there has been a failure to reach agreement on the rights of citizens, whether they be EU citizens living in the UK or UK citizens living in the EU. So for businesses, they're unsure at that point as to whether or not their workforce can continue to remain and continue to work and continue to contribute to the business. A hard Brexit assumes that there's been a failure to reach agreement on access to markets. And so suddenly financial passports disappear. For pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceuticals manufactured in the UK, will they be capable of being sold within Europe as they no longer comply now with the European standards? The type of chaos that that will cause, I think, would be absolutely enormous. There's also the logistical issue that the imposition of tariffs will create real logistical problems for governments on both sides. There have been statistics that have shown that a 6-minute delay in lorries passing through Dover would result in traffic chaos right around London. And I think those sorts of issues are the sorts of issues that really need to be understood and grasped when people talk about hard Brexit. Hard Brexit isn't an abstract thing, it is something that will really create chaos for business.
Enda, if there is a transition deal for the UK, how long could or should that period be for?
Well, transition periods are there to conclude agreements. So it's got to be as long as is necessary. This is very complex, not done before. And when you consider things like the new Open Skies Agreement between the UK and the EU, matters of security, matters of defence, matters of cooperation in terms of cyber attacks and so on, these are areas that have not been thought through at all. This transition period will last much longer than people imagine.
And Enda, is the EU being too tough on Britain in terms of the EU's approach to the negotiations?
No. Europe has been very fair and very upfront and very truthful about what needs to be done here. And I agree with Michael. You need stability, you need confidence, you need decisiveness for businesses to plan, because they will start planning about their future in Britain or not in Britain by early spring of 2018.
I think it's also worth noting that Britain signed up to and agreed to the structure of the talks. They knew entering into the talks what structure those talks were going to take. And I think that all that has happened at the EU level is that they are looking for progress on the issues that it was agreed would be discussed first before they move on to the next phase, which is what was agreed at the outset. So personally, I don't believe the EU is being unfair in its approach.
Enda, you have previously co-chaired World Trade Talks. Can the UK ever sign enough deals with non-EU states to compensate for the loss of access to the EU single market?
Probably not. Europe has had exclusive competence in drafting trade agreements for Europe since its foundation. So the United Kingdom has not drafted any trade deal with any country in the last 40 years. You operate within the agreed trade agreements that are in place. Now, it took 7 years to put the CETA agreement in place between Europe and Canada. And Canada is a country that is very easy to deal with. So of the 47 or 50 trade agreements that are being talked about, these will take years to negotiate in detail. So this is a very complicated area. And I would hope, again, that realism will dawn here and that the transition period will see how the reaction will impact upon the economies of Europe and particularly on the United Kingdom.
Michael, your views on that in terms of the UK and its signalling of signing trade deals with third countries?
I would agree with what has just been said by Enda. I think that it's very difficult to see how the UK can ever negotiate a set of agreements that will match the agreements that the EU has been able to put together. Because in any negotiation, the size of the purchasing power of the party will determine the likely outcome of the negotiation. And a bloc of 500 million people simply has more purchasing power than a bloc like the UK on its own. And I think that will always end up influencing the attitude of the other side in those negotiations. It will always end up influencing what the UK can get out of those negotiations. And I personally believe it will be difficult for them to ever receive more priority than a larger trading bloc like the EU.
And with respect to Ireland and the low corporate tax rate of 12.5%, is that non-negotiable?
Yes, it's non-negotiable. This has been a red issue for Ireland since 12.5% became our tax rate. But it's not just about any government in Ireland. This has the force of the European Union treaties. In fact, Ireland has a protocol inserted into the European Union treaties stipulating that our tax rate is 12.5%. Now, tax rates at corporate level are a matter of national competence in accordance with the European Union treaties. Now, nobody can tell us or order us to change the rate of corporate tax. I would say this, we're an island nation, we have to export 90% of what we produce. And for American investment or foreign direct investment, such as Matheson's deal with on a regular basis, stability and certainty is critical. So companies like to know, what is your tax rate? Ours has never changed, neither up nor down, across the entire country and covering all sectors. And that's the way it's going to stay.
So is Ireland still the best EU country for multinationals looking to locate in Europe and access European markets post-Brexit?
Well, I would say that Ireland continues to be a very attractive location for foreign direct investment. Why is that? English-speaking, common law system, a proven record of 50 years of involvement directly into Europe. But we compete with other countries, and we compete hard, but we compete fairly. So we would say, hand on heart, to any country in the world, but particularly to the United States, you have 1,000 multinationals in Ireland. Go talk to them. Talk about their experience. And we see even a greater opportunity up ahead now, having been fully compliant with the OECD, having the first OECD compliant knowledge box at 6.25%, to make it even more attractive for companies to want to come and work and site in Ireland as a location on its own, but also as a front lead point for investment into Europe and beyond.
And Michael, in terms of your clients, how are they viewing the different gateway options, if you like, at the moment?
The key thing clients are looking for is certainty and stability. There is so much uncertainty and so much instability in the world. They are attaching a real premium to places that can provide them with certainty of tax treatment, certainty of legal treatment, and certainty of regulatory treatment. And I think Ireland offers all of those. It has a long track record of engaging with international companies and acting as a gateway, not just to the EU, but to global markets generally. And our clients see that and put great value in that. I think Ireland's history of defending the interests of international companies when it's appropriate for it to do so has also been noted by our international clients, as indeed has Ireland's consistent defence of its tax rate. And I think successive governments are to be praised for that, but in particular the government of Enda Kenny, which withstood some significant pressure during the financial crisis to increase our corporate tax rate, and yet took the very sensible and wise decision that that was not the correct thing to do for the country or for business, and I think the country has benefited from that.
And in the context of Brexit and the Northern Ireland border, is there a way forward on that?
Well, the way forward has been planned and worked upon for very many years. And that concluded 20 years ago with the Good Friday Agreement, which is an internationally binding agreement lodged down the road in the United Nations, accepted by Europe, accepted by America, and accepted by both governments. We do not want to see and would not allow any diminution of anything to do with the Good Friday Agreement. Brexit has a potential to impact upon that severely. We will not stand, and the Taoiseach has outlined this now, for a situation of a return to a border of the past. Prime Minister Cameron accepted this, Prime Minister May accepts this, but there needs to be a unique solution to an unprecedented problem. The situation that we have at the moment is that the border is only political. It is invisible. People cross that in their thousands every day to do business and go about their daily work. Products, manufacturing, business conducted north-south. That's the way the people of the north and the people of the south want it to continue. The answer lies, wherever the imagination of the British government can be, in bringing about a working, effective, non-obstructive solution. That's what we have at the moment. That's what we'd like to continue.
And with the UK leaving the EU, Ireland is losing its biggest ally. What are the implications of that for Ireland?
There's no doubt that it's better to have more allies at a table than fewer allies at the table, but I do believe that Ireland has an excellent relationship with many other EU countries, has common concerns with many other EU countries, and at times in the past, in fact, has had positions that were different to the UK's position and still was able to manoeuvre a solution that worked for Ireland. I think it's instructive that if you look at the 3 items which the EU agreed should be dealt with before any trade talks began, that the Irish border question was one of those 3 issues, put on that agenda at a time when the UK had handed in its notice to leave the EU. So there's no doubt in my mind that Ireland can continue and will continue to be a central player in the EU and to take a very active part in EU decision making.
And a final word from you both. Prime Minister Theresa May has had a trying time in the last few weeks. If you were to give her one key piece of advice now, what would it be?
Well, I wouldn't like to give any other Prime Minister advice, but I would say this: when you have the responsibility at Prime Ministerial level, use it.
Michael?
I'm definitely not going to give advice to Prime Ministers.
Well, we will conclude on that note. Enda Kenny TD and Michael Jackson, Managing Partner of Matheson, thank you for sharing your time with us today to give your insights on Brexit. Thank you both.